In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And lunch, which, on a hive world, is the same thing as yesterday's dead, pressed into a grey block and stamped with the Aquila. You learn the taste before you learn your own name. Hey, I'm your brother from the void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is about food, or what passes for food when 12 billion people are stacked 11 kilometers high, and the only thing that's never in short supply is bodies. This is the story of Tembrick Wool, ration runner in the lowest depths of Hive Moragul. A man who hauled canisters of corpse-starch to feeding stations every day for years. Simple work, reliable work. The carts come down, the lines form up, the cycle continues. Until one day, the canisters arrive light, and the blocks taste wrong. And the woman who runs the gruel post spits on the floor and says they're going to have a problem. She was underselling it. This is a story about what happens when the machine that keeps a hive alive starts grinding to a halt, and what crawls out of the cracks when it does. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. You learn the taste of the dead before you learn your own name. That is the first truth of the hive. Some people out there on worlds with open skies and soil that grows things, they might retch at the thought, might clutch their stomachs and whisper prayers. But where I come from, in the bowels of Hive Moragul on a world the Administratum ledgers call Vothrek Quintus, you eat what you are given or you do not eat at all. And what you are given is the dead, pressed into grey blocks, stamped with the Aquila, chewed between teeth that ache from chemical residue, and swallowed with recycled water that tastes of iron and old sweat. Corpse-starch, the foundation of everything. The meal of 12 billion mouths, 3 times a day, every day, from the moment the feeding tubes are pulled from your infant lips to the moment your own body is scraped off whatever surface it falls upon and loaded onto the carts that will carry you to the grinders. The cycle. You live, you work, you eat the dead, and then you become what someone else eats. I used to think there was a kind of dignity in that. An honesty, even. Nothing wasted. Not even you. My name is Tembrick Wool. I was a ration runner in Substratum 61, the level everyone calls the dregs, though nobody remembers who named it that or when. Maybe it named itself. The dregs sat low enough that the air tasted like rust and old coolant, but high enough that the sump gases had not yet eaten through the floor plating. A narrow margin. Everything in the lower hive is a narrow margin. You live in the space between one disaster and the next, and you count yourself fortunate for every cycle that passes without the ceiling caving in, or a pipe bursting, or an enforcer patrol deciding your habstack looks like it might be harboring dissidents. I ran rations for a distribution node called Gruel Post Hethken, named after some administrator who had been dead for 400 years, but whose name was still stenciled on the dispensary wall in faded yellow paint. Every third cycle, the carts came down from the Rendery, the massive corpse processing district 14 levels above us, and I helped unload the sealed canisters, checked the seals for tampering and rot breach, and then hauled them on a shoulder yoke through the corridors of the dregs to the feeding stations where the lines began forming before the lumen strips even flickered to their pale imitation of daylight. I want you to understand something before I go further. Corpse-starch is not what you might imagine. It is not flesh. It is not recognizable. By the time the Rendery is done with a body, there is nothing left that looks like what it once was. The process strips everything. Bones are separated first, cracked and ground into calcium powder that gets mixed back into the paste as mineral filler. Soft tissue goes through enzymatic vats, enormous tanks of chemical solution that dissolve muscle and fat and organ meat into a uniform slurry over the course of several hours. The smell of those vats is something I cannot describe to you in any way that would be adequate. It is not the smell of death, not exactly. It is more chemical than biological, a sharp, stinging stench like industrial solvent mixed with something sweet and deeply wrong that coats the inside of your nose and stays there for hours. The slurry gets heated, filtered, centrifuged to remove moisture, and then compressed under enormous hydraulic presses into the dense, chalite gray blocks that are the standard ration unit of the lower hive. Each block weighs about half a kilogram. Each block represents, on average, the processed remains of approximately 1/5 of a human body, mixed with fungal biomass and synthetic nutrient additives to stretch the yield. The blocks are stamped, sealed in wax paper wrapping, packed into canisters of 40, and sent down the supply chain. I have eaten corpse-starch every day of my life. The taste varies depending on the batch and the season, if you can call it that, in a place where there are no seasons, only shifts. Sometimes it is almost bland, like chewing on damp chalk. Other times it has a faintly sour edge, or a bitterness that sits at the back of the tongue long after the meal is over. There are rumors, always rumors, about what changes the taste. A batch made mostly from plague dead tastes different from a batch made from manufactorum accident victims. Bodies that have been in the reclamation queue too long before processing give the starch a sharper, more acidic flavor. The old runners used to claim they could tell what killed the people in any given block just by chewing slowly enough. I never believed them, but I never argued either. In the dregs, your beliefs are your own business. The thing about corpse-starch that outsiders never understand is that it works. It keeps you alive. It is not pleasant, it is not satisfying in the way I imagine real food must be, but it fills the hollow in your gut and gives your body enough to keep moving through another shift. And in a Hive City where 12 billion souls are stacked on top of each other in a structure that rises 11 kilometers above the planetary surface and bores 9 kilometers into the bedrock, where every breath of air has been recycled through 10,000 lungs, and every drop of water has been filtered from the sweat and waste of your neighbors, corpse-starch is nothing less than a miracle of logistics. The Imperium of man is many things. Cruel, certainly. Indifferent, always. But efficient in its own grinding, relentless way when it comes to keeping the machinery of human existence turning just fast enough that the whole thing does not fly apart. Corpse-starch is the grease in that machine. The Rendery never stops. The carts never stop. The lines at the feeding stations never stop. And the dead never stop coming, because on a world like Vothrek Quintus, death is the one commodity that is never in short supply. Or so we believed. I need to tell you about the Rendery in more detail, because you have to understand how central it was to everything. Hive Moragul had 6 primary Rendery complexes, each one the size of a small city in its own right, occupying entire levels of the hive and employing tens of thousands of workers in various capacities. The largest, Rendery Primus, sat on level 47 and processed an estimated 900,000 bodies per standard Terran day. That number always struck me when I first heard it. 900,000 every day, fed into the grinders and the vats and the presses, emerging at the other end as neat gray blocks in sealed canisters. The Guild of the Pallid Hand controlled the entire operation, a guild so old and so powerful that even the planetary governor treated their guildmaster with a deference usually reserved for visiting ecclesiarchal dignitaries. The guild collected the dead from every level of the hive through a network of corpse haulers, mortuary wagons, and collection points that operated with mechanical precision. They had agreements with the enforcers, the manufactorum overseers, the hab block wardens, the medici stations, everyone. A body was reported, tagged, collected, and delivered to the nearest Rendery within 48 hours. That was the standard. That was the promise. And for as long as anyone could remember, the promise was kept. I want to paint you a picture of what normal looked like in the dregs, because you need that picture in your mind before I show you what it looked like after. Normal was waking in a hab cell, barely large enough to lie flat in, the walls slick with condensation, the air warm and stale. Normal was pulling on your work boots, the leather cracked and repaired so many times, the original material was barely visible under the patches, and walking through corridors where the lumen strips buzzed and flickered, casting everything in a queasy yellow-white light that made everyone look sickly even when they were not. Normal was the queue at the feeding station, 200 people deep, shuffling forward in silence or near silence, the occasional murmur of conversation, the occasional cough. Normal was receiving your ration block, breaking it in half because the full block was for the shift ahead and you needed to save part of it for the shift after, and eating it standing up because there were no chairs, no tables, just the press of bodies and the sound of chewing and the faint, ever-present hum of the hive's machinery vibrating through the floor. Normal was carrying the canisters on your shoulder through corridors where you knew every crack in the wall, every dripping pipe, every spot where you had to duck your head to avoid the cable bundles that sagged from the ceiling. Normal was exchanging nods with the same faces you saw every cycle, people whose names you might or might not know, but whose presence was as familiar as the hum of the air recyclers. Normal was predictable. Normal was the same. I need to tell you about Ferusa before I tell you about what happened, because she deserves that. Ferusa Dolm had been overseer of Gruul Post Hethkin for longer than most people on our level had been alive, and she ran the place with a severity that could make grown men flinch. But there was more to her than the iron face she showed the world. I learned this on a night shift about 2 years before the famine, when I came in early to prep the loading dock and found her sitting on an overturned canister in the back room, eating a ration block. Nothing unusual about that, except she was eating it slowly, which is not something people in the dregs do. You eat fast down here because the taste does not improve with contemplation. But Ferusa was chewing each bite with her eyes half closed, and when she noticed me in the doorway, she did not snap at me the way she normally would have. Instead, she held up the block and said that this batch was from level 39, that she could tell because the Rendery up there used a slightly different filtration process that left the starch marginally less bitter. She said she remembered a batch like this from when she was a girl, before she started work, when her mother was still alive. Her mother had worked the vats in one of the subsidiary Renderies, a low-level position that involved stirring the enzymatic solution with a long iron paddle for 12 hours at a stretch. The chemical exposure had eaten through her mother's hands over the years, dissolved the skin layer by layer until the flesh underneath was permanently raw, and she had died when Ferusa was 11, her lungs full of the same solution that had taken her fingers. Ferusa told me this without emotion, the way you state a logistical fact, and then she said something I never forgot. She said that her mother's body had been processed in the same Rendery where she had worked, and that the starch from that batch had been distributed to the same level where Ferusa and her mother had lived, and that Ferusa had eaten it. She had not known at the time. She found out later, checking the records with the meticulous attention to documentation that would define the rest of her career. She had eaten her own mother, rendered and pressed and stamped with the Aquila, and she had not even noticed a difference in the taste. The cycle, she said. That is what the cycle means. Then she finished her block, brushed the crumbs off her hands, stood up, and went back to checking manifests. And we never spoke of it again. But after that night, the way I saw her changed. The iron was still there, the discipline, the unshakable routine. But underneath it was something else. A knowledge that went deeper than procedure, an understanding of what the hive really was and what it did to the people inside it that she carried silently and without complaint, the way she carried everything. Then it stopped being the same. I will tell you exactly when I first noticed, because some moments cut themselves into your memory with such precision that they remain sharp, no matter how much time passes or how much you might wish to forget them. It was the 43rd cycle of what the Administratum calendar designated the Year of Reckoning 841, post-Foundation. I know this because the cycle number was stamped on every canister we received, and I had developed the habit of checking it as part of my inspection routine, not out of any particular diligence, but because checking the numbers gave me something to focus on other than the weight of the canisters and the ache in my shoulders. Cycle 43. The carts came down from the Rendery as usual, grinding along the rail tracks that connected the upper distribution network to our node. But when I broke the seal on the first canister to do my inspection, I noticed two things immediately. The first was the quantity. Each canister was supposed to hold 40 standard ration blocks. This one held 31. I counted again to be sure. 31. I opened the next one. 28. The third held 34. Every canister in the shipment was short, some by a few blocks, some by nearly a quarter of the expected load. The second thing I noticed was the starch itself. The blocks were lighter than usual, both in weight and in color. The standard gray had shifted to something paler, almost yellowish, and the texture was different. Where a normal block was dense and slightly waxy to the touch, these were grainier, more crumbly, as if the compression had been insufficient or the mixture had been cut with too much filler. I broke one open, and the interior was riddled with tiny air pockets, like frozen foam. And the taste, when I tested a corner against my tongue, was wrong. Not just different, wrong. A bitterness that was sharper than anything I had encountered in 23 years of eating corpse-starch, underlaid by a gritty, almost sandy texture that crunched between my teeth and left a chemical aftertaste that made my eyes water. I brought it to Ferusa. She was built like the bulkhead doors in the Enforcer precinct, wide and solid and difficult to move, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same gray rockite as the hive walls. She took the block from me, turned it over in her thick fingers, bit off a corner, chewed it slowly, and spat it onto the floor. She looked at me. She looked at the canister manifest. She looked at the blocks again. Then she said, in a voice that carried the weight of someone who had been quietly dreading this moment for longer than she would ever admit, that we were going to have a problem. I did not understand at the time how much of an understatement that was. Ferusa sent a complaint up the chain to the distribution overseer for our sector, a mid-level Administratum functionary named Clericus Pile Junstret, who operated from an office 6 levels above us that none of us had ever seen. The complaint was logged, stamped, and filed. We received a form response within 2 cycles, informing us that supply fluctuations were within acceptable operational parameters, and that all distribution nodes were advised to adjust portion allocations accordingly. Adjust portion allocations accordingly. That phrase, written by some functionary in an office with actual climate control and probably real food on his desk, became the most hated string of words in the dregs within a matter of days. Because what it meant in practice was that people who were already eating barely enough to sustain themselves were now expected to eat less. And not just a little less. The shortfall grew with every shipment. By cycle 48, the canisters were arriving half full. By cycle 52, they were barely a third, and the starch itself continued to deteriorate, the blocks becoming lighter, grittier, the taste increasingly acrid, as if the Rendery was scraping the bottom of its vats and pressing whatever residue remained into something that resembled food only in the loosest possible definition. The lines at the feeding stations grew longer. The silence in those lines grew heavier. People who had shuffled forward with the patient resignation of a lifetime began to look at each other differently. Not with hostility, not yet, but with a new kind of awareness, an alertness in the eyes, a tension in the jaw. The hive teaches you to read bodies, because bodies tell you things that voices never will, and the bodies in those lines were telling me that something fundamental was changing. The predictable rhythm that had governed life in the dregs since before any of us were born was faltering, and everyone could feel it, even if no one was yet willing to say it out loud. I started hearing rumors. Rumors travel through the lower hive the way water travels through cracks in old rockite, finding every gap, seeping into every space, impossible to stop. The Rendery was slowing down. Not just our Rendery, not just the local processing node, but the entire network. All 6 primary complexes were reporting shortfalls. The Guild of the Pallid Hand had issued an internal memorandum. Someone claimed to have seen a copy, stating that incoming corpse volumes had dropped by 40% over the preceding 30 cycles, and that the cause was under investigation. 40%. On a world where 900,000 bodies a day was the baseline for a single Rendery, a 40% drop meant hundreds of thousands fewer bodies entering the system every day. And on a hive world, fewer bodies entering the system meant one of 2 things. Either fewer people were dying, which was unlikely to the point of absurdity, or the bodies were being diverted, lost, or rendered unsuitable for processing. Nobody believed the first option, which left the second. And the second raised questions that nobody in the dregs had the authority or the information to answer. I remember standing in the corridor outside Gruel Post Hethkin after my shift, leaning against the wall with a half-eaten ration block in my hand, the gritty, bitter taste of it still on my tongue, and feeling something I had not felt before. Not fear, not exactly. Something older and deeper, the kind of feeling that lives in the bones rather than the brain, that does not need words or thoughts to express itself, that simply is. I was a man standing in a city of 12 billion people, holding a piece of food made from the dead, and for the first time in my life I was looking at it and wondering if there would be more tomorrow. There is a saying in the lower hive. I do not know where it comes from or how old it is, but every child in the dregs learns it before they learn their prayers. The hive eats. That is what it does. It eats everything. Metal, rock, air, water, people. It takes in, and it breaks down, and it uses, and it takes in again. The hive eats. And what the hive cannot eat, it forgets. I had lived my entire life inside that cycle, secure in the knowledge that however miserable and grinding my existence might be, the cycle would continue. The Rendery would process. The carts would deliver. The feeding stations would dispense. The dead would feed the living, and the living would eventually feed the dead. And the great wheel would turn and turn and turn forever, because that is what the Imperium demanded and what the hive provided. But what happens when the wheel stops? I am going to tell you. I am going to tell you everything, because someone should know. Because when the ships finally came, when the Imperium finally remembered that Vothrek Quintus existed and sent its supply convoys and its assessment teams and its Administratum auditors with their clean uniforms and their data slates, they found the hive and they wrote their reports and they sealed their files and they moved on to the next crisis in the next subsector. And those reports, I am certain, do not contain what I am about to tell you. They contain numbers, casualty estimates, logistics failures, supply chain breakdowns, They contain the language of bureaucracy, which is the language the Imperium uses to make the unthinkable into something that can be filed and forgotten. But they do not contain what it was like to be inside it, to live through it, to watch 12 billion people learn, in the space of a few short months, exactly what they are capable of when the food runs out. I survived. That is the simple way to put it. Tembrek Wohl survived the famine of Hive Moragul. But the thing that survived, the thing that sits here now, speaking these words, remembering what it remembers and feeling what it feels, is not entirely the same Tembrek Wohl who stood in that corridor with a half-eaten ration block and wondered about tomorrow. Something happened to me. Something was done to me. And I need to tell you about that too, because it is part of the story. Maybe the most important part, though I did not understand it at the time, and I am not sure I understand it fully even now. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me go back. Let me go back to the beginning of the end, when the rations turned gritty and the canisters came down light, and the rumor water began seeping through the cracks. Let me tell you about the first death I saw that was not from the usual causes, not from manufactorum accidents or enforcer bullets, or the slow grinding attrition of a body worked past its breaking point. The first death I saw that was caused by nothing more complicated than an empty stomach and a mind that had forgotten how to wait. His name was Groton. Just Groton. No family name that anyone knew, no HAB block registration, no work assignment that showed up on any roster I had access to. He was one of the drifters who lived in the interstitial spaces of the dregs, the maintenance crawlways and abandoned utility rooms and dead-end corridors where the lumen strips had burned out and never been replaced. Every level of the lower hive had them. People who had fallen off the bottom of a social order that was already at the bottom of everything else. Groton was old, though in the underhive old might mean 40 or it might mean 60. Because the years down here do not mark themselves on the body the way I imagine they do, in places where the light is real and the air is clean. He had a beard the color of pipe slag and eyes that were always slightly too wide, as if he was perpetually surprised to still be alive. He used to sit near Gruel Post Hethkin during distribution hours, not in the line itself, but off to one side, waiting for the scraps. There were always scraps. People dropped crumbs, left corners of ration blocks uneaten because the taste was too foul even by underhive standards, discarded the wax paper wrappings with residue still clinging to them. Groton collected these things with the careful patience of someone who had turned survival into an art form reduced to its smallest possible gestures. I found him on Cycle 55, 3 corridors from the feeding station, curled into the angle where a ventilation duct met the floor. His mouth was open. His fingers were clenched around a piece of wax paper wrapper that was completely clean, sucked and chewed until not a molecule of nutrient residue remained. There was nothing remarkable about his body. No wounds, no marks of violence, no sign of illness beyond the general wasting that affected everyone in the dregs to some degree. He was simply empty. The hive had eaten him from the inside, consumed the fat and the muscle and whatever reserves his body had maintained through years of marginal existence, and when there was nothing left to consume, it had stopped. The look on his face was not peaceful. I have heard people describe the faces of the dead as peaceful, and that is a lie, or at least a lie, as it applies to the dead of the underhive. Groton's face was a mask of effort, the muscles drawn tight, the jaw clenched, as if dying had been a physical labor he had performed with the same grim determination he had applied to everything else. I reported the body to the corpse collection point, as was standard procedure. The Guild of the Pallid Hand operated a collection station on our level, staffed by 3 corpse haulers who worked in shifts. When I arrived, I found the station unmanned. The hauler's equipment was there, the wheeled cart and the body hooks and the counting slates. but the haulers themselves were gone. A notice, handwritten on what looked like a piece torn from a ration wrapper, was pinned to the door. It read, "Collection suspended pending further instruction." I learned later what had happened to the guild. The Guild of the Pallid Hand, the institution that had controlled the reclamation of the dead for centuries, that had been so powerful even the planetary governor deferred to its guildmaster, had fractured from the inside. When the Greymouth rendered their entire operation functionally impossible, the guild's leadership retreated to their fortified compounds on the Rendery levels and sealed the doors. But the rank-and-file haulers, the corpse workers and cart drivers and vat tenders who had spent their lives handling the dead, found themselves stranded throughout the hive with no supplies and no orders. Some simply vanished into the general population. Others, and this is the part that stays with me, took the skills they had. They knew bodies. They knew how to butcher, how to strip, how to render. The Guild Knives' most efficient operatives, I would later discover, were former guild haulers. The institution that had fed the hive for centuries became, in its dissolution, the backbone of the cannibalism that replaced it. The cycle continued. It just lost its paperwork. I stood there reading the notice for what felt like a long time. In 23 years of living in the dregs, I had never seen the corpse collection suspended. Not during the pipe-burst flood of year 829. Not during the Enforcer lockdown of 836. Not ever. The dead were always collected. The dead were the raw material. The dead were the food. It was Ferusa who told me the truth, or at least as much of it as had filtered down to our level. She called a meeting of the ration runners, all 9 of us, in the back room of Gruel Post Hethkin, a cramped space that smelled of chemical sealant and old sweat and the lingering residue of 1,000 opened canisters. I remember looking around the room at the other runners and seeing my own fear reflected back in 8 different faces. Pyle, who ran the eastern sector. The twins, Eshka and Dron, who handled the freight elevators. Mossoff, who had a bad knee and a worse temper. Orvek Plan, who ran the route through the deep corridors near the eastern perimeter and who was, if I am being honest, the closest thing I had to a friend in the dregs. Orvek and I had run adjacent routes for 11 years. We ate together most cycles, sitting on the loading dock after our shifts, breaking our ration blocks and talking about nothing in particular, the kind of conversation that fills the silence without demanding anything of either party. He was a quiet man, broad across the shoulders, with a face that wore a permanent expression of mild bemusement, as if the universe was a joke he was still waiting to fully understand. He laughed easily and rarely complained and carried his canisters with the kind of effortless strength that made the rest of us feel inadequate. Of all the people in that room, Orvek was the one I would have expected to endure anything. He seemed built for it, physically and temperamentally, a man designed by the hive itself to absorb whatever it threw at him and keep moving. Ferusa looked tired. Not the ordinary tiredness that came from long shifts and bad air, but a deeper exhaustion, something that had settled into her bones and was pulling her face downward like gravity had suddenly doubled. She told us that the shortfalls were not a supply fluctuation. She told us they were not going to self-correct. She told us that a contamination event had occurred in the upper levels, something that the authorities were calling the Greymouth, though whether that was an official designation or a name invented by frightened people in dark corridors, she did not know. The Greymouth was some kind of biological agent, a pathogen or a toxin or something in between that had entered the corpse processing chain and rendered entire batches of starch inedible. Not just substandard, not just gritty or bitter, but actively toxic. People who had eaten affected batches were developing symptoms. Vomiting, first, then convulsions, then a graying of the skin, starting at the extremities and spreading inward, accompanied by a progressive softening of the flesh until the affected tissue began to slough off in wet, heavy sheets. I remember hearing this and feeling my stomach clench, not from nausea but from the sudden, vivid awareness that the thing we had been eating for our entire lives could turn on us, that the dead could reach back through the processing chain and kill us even after we had ground them into paste. The Renderies had been forced to reject enormous quantities of incoming bodies because the contamination made them unsuitable for processing. And at the same time, the people dying from eating contaminated starch were themselves too toxic to be processed, creating a cascading failure in the entire system. Where the Greymouth had come from, nobody knew. Ferusa said the official line was spontaneous biological contamination, a mutation in the corpse processing ecosystem, the kind of thing that could happen in any system that dealt with organic matter at industrial scale. But she also said quietly, almost as an afterthought, that the contamination pattern was strange. It had not spread outward from a single point the way a natural pathogen would. It had appeared simultaneously in multiple renderies, in multiple processing vats, on multiple levels, as if it had been introduced at several points in the supply chain at once. She did not speculate about what this meant. She simply stated it and moved on, the way she stated everything, as a fact to be filed and dealt with in its proper order. But I saw the way her jaw tightened when she said it, and I filed it away in the part of my mind where I kept the things I did not yet understand, but suspected I would need later. Ferusa told us this in a flat, steady voice, the same voice she used to read shift rosters and canister manifests. And I think that was what frightened me most. Not the information itself, terrible as it was, but the way she delivered it, as if she had already processed it, already moved past the horror and the disbelief, and arrived at the place where you simply accept what is happening and begin to calculate what it means. She told us that the remaining clean starch was being rationed. She told us that distribution would be cut to once per cycle instead of 3 times. She told us that the portion allocation per person was being reduced to 1/4 of a standard block. She told us that this was not negotiable and not temporary, and that if anyone asked, we were to say that the situation was under review by the appropriate authorities. 1/4 of a standard block. Hold that number in your mind. A full standard block of corpse starch provided approximately 1,200 calories, barely enough to sustain a human body performing moderate physical labor. 1/4 of a block provided 300 calories per day. For people who had already been living at the edge of nutritional sufficiency their entire lives. For people who worked 12-hour shifts hauling cargo, operating machinery, maintaining the endless infrastructure of a city that never slept. 300 calories. That is not a ration. That is a countdown. The effect on the dregs was immediate and visible. Within 10 cycles of the reduced distribution, the corridors looked different. People moved differently. Slower, obviously, because the body conserves energy when fuel is scarce, but also more carefully, more deliberately, as if every step required a conscious decision. Eyes changed. I noticed this early, and it stayed with me throughout everything that followed. The eyes of hungry people are not the same as the eyes of fed people. There is a sharpness to them, a focus that has nothing to do with intelligence or alertness, and everything to do with the most basic calculation a living creature can perform, which is the constant, unending assessment of where the next meal might come from. I saw it in the feeding station lines. I saw it in the hab corridors. I saw it in the faces of people I had known for years, people I had nodded to every cycle, people whose names I knew and whose children I had watched grow up. The hunger was in their eyes like a new light, cold and searching, and it never turned off. The vermin went first. Within 20 cycles of the ration cuts, the vermin population in the dregs was functionally extinct. Rats, pipe crawlers, hive roaches, every creature that moved and could be caught was caught, killed, and consumed. Children hunted in packs through the crawlways, fast and quiet and deadly serious. I watched a woman boil a handful of hive roaches in a tin cup, crush them into paste, and feed it to her infant child. The child ate it without complaint. Hunger is the only seasoning that matters. The next thing to disappear was the fungal growth. In the damp sections of the lower hive, various species of fungus grew in patches that had been part of the environment for generations. Desperate people are not selective. The fungal patches were scraped clean, and then people began opening the walls themselves, pulling out insulation to get at the colonies growing behind the panels. I saw corridors stripped to the structural frame, the exposed bones of the hive laid bare by people eating its flesh, just as it had always eaten theirs. During this time, I continued to run rations. The shipments from the Rendery had dwindled to a fraction of their former volume, but they had not stopped entirely, and whatever came down the rails was precious beyond anything I had previously conceived. Ferusa doubled the security around Gruel Post Hethkin. She called in favors from people she had known for decades, men and women who had worked the distribution network in various capacities and who still had access to tools that could serve as weapons. Pipe wrenches, pry bars, heavy-gauge wire cutters. We did not carry them openly, but they were there, tucked into belts and tool loops, ready. Because the feeding station lines were no longer silent, the shuffling patience that had once characterized them was gone, replaced by something taut and brittle. There were incidents, pushing, shouting. On cycle 63, a man at the front of the line refused to accept his quarter-block ration and demanded more. And when the server told him there was no more, he reached across the counter and tried to take the canister. 3 of us pulled him off. He fought like something that had forgotten how to be human. All teeth and elbows and a screaming that was not words, just sound, raw and animal. We pinned him down and held him until he stopped struggling. And when we let him up, he sat on the floor and stared at nothing and did not move or speak for the rest of the cycle. What became of him, I cannot say. It was around this time that I met the Administratum logistician. His name was Brevin Hawk, and he worked in the supply management office on level 30, which was considered mid-hive, and was therefore almost unimaginably far above the dregs in both altitude and social standing. I met him because he came down. That fact alone should tell you how far things had deteriorated, because Administratum functionaries did not visit Substratum 61. They did not visit anything below level 40. The lower hive, for them, was an abstraction, a set of numbers on a data slate representing population counts and consumption rates and delivery quotas. It was not a place where actual people ate and breathed and died, but Brevin Hawk came down. He descended through 31 levels of increasingly degraded infrastructure, through corridors that grew darker and narrower and more hostile with every level, past barricades and checkpoints where men with improvised weapons stared at his clean Administratum robe with expressions that wavered between suspicion and predatory interest. He came down because he needed to see. That is what he told me later. He needed to see what his numbers looked like when they had faces. I found him standing in the corridor outside Gruel Post Hethkin, staring at the feeding station with an expression I could not immediately read. He was a small man, thin in the way that desk workers are thin, with narrow shoulders and hands that looked like they had never held anything heavier than an autoquill. His skin had the pallor of the mid-hive, a shade lighter than ours, marking him as clearly as a brand. He should have been robbed, beaten, or worse within minutes of entering the dregs. The fact that he was not was either miraculous or evidence that the people on our level were already too weak to bother. He turned to me as I approached, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had recently looked into something that had broken a fundamental component of his understanding of the world, and was still trying to function with the broken piece rattling around inside him. He told me his name. He told me what he did, and then he told me the numbers because the numbers were the only language he had. Brevin Hawk had been one of the first people to run the full calculation. He had pulled the production data from all 6 renderies, cross-referenced it with the population figures, factored in the contamination rates and the reduced processing capacity, and arrived at a conclusion that he had written on a single sheet of parchment in the neat, careful handwriting that the Administratum cultivated in its functionaries. The conclusion was this: at current rates of decline, the corpse-starch reserves of Hive Moragul would be fully exhausted within 48 standard Terran days. After that, 10 billion people in the lower and mid-hive would have no food source of any kind. He told me this while standing in a corridor of Substratum 61, surrounded by people who were already starving, in a voice that was quiet and precise and utterly without emotion. And then he stopped talking and looked at me as if waiting for me to say something that would make the numbers mean something different. I asked him why he had come down. He said he had filed the report. He had submitted it through the proper channels with the proper seals to the proper authorities. He had activated the emergency requisition protocols. He had done everything the system required him to do, and then he had waited. And nothing had happened. The report had been acknowledged, stamped, logged, and absorbed into the vast digestive tract of the Administratum, where documents go to be processed and prioritized, and cross-referenced and ultimately forgotten, because the next crisis always arrives before the current one is resolved. No help was coming. Vothrek Quintus was a world of moderate strategic importance in a sub-sector that was currently dealing with an orc incursion 3 systems away, and the Departamento Munitorum had redirected the supply convoys that should have been inbound with supplementary rations. The next scheduled supply run was 120 standard days away. The starch would last 48. The mathematics was simple. The mathematics was final. And Brevin Hawk, who had spent his entire career believing that the system worked because it was a system, and systems function according to their design, had discovered that the system did not care whether its components starved, any more than a machine cares whether the fuel it burns was once alive. He stood in our corridor for perhaps 20 minutes. He did not eat anything, though Ferusa offered him a sliver of ration block from our diminishing reserve, a gesture of hospitality that was staggering in its generosity given the circumstances. He declined. He said he was not hungry, though the way his eyes tracked the sliver as Ferusa held it out suggested otherwise. Then he straightened his robe, nodded to me with a formality that was almost comically out of place in a corridor where the walls were streaked with condensation and the air tasted like rust, and he left. He walked back toward the stairwell that would take him up through 31 levels to his office on level 30, where his data slate sat on his desk with the numbers still glowing on its screen. I watched him go. His back was very straight. His steps were very precise. He moved like a man performing a routine that his body knew by memory, even though his mind had long since stopped believing it meant anything. I never saw him again. I heard weeks later that he had been found in his office, seated at his desk, his ledger open in front of him, the auto-quill still in his hand. The cause of death was listed as cardiac failure. But I think the truth is simpler and worse than that. I think Brevin Hawk died of knowing. Whatever Brevin Hawk's numbers said, the numbers did not care who read them. The numbers kept moving. And in the dregs, far below the clean offices and the data slates, and the neat columns of figures, the numbers translated into something much simpler and much more terrible. They translated into empty canisters, empty feeding stations, empty stomachs, and the slow, awful realization, spreading through 12 billion people like the Grey Mouth itself, that the cycle had broken and no one was coming to fix it. By cycle 70, the distribution network in the dregs had effectively collapsed. The last shipment from the Rendery contained 11 canisters for a population that required 900. Ferusa distributed what there was with the grim efficiency of a woman who knew she was performing a meaningless gesture, but refused to abandon the routine that defined her. We divided the blocks into slivers so thin they were translucent, portioned them out to the front of the line, and when they were gone we closed the station and locked the shutters and stood behind them, listening to the crowd outside and the sound it made when it realized there was nothing left. The sound was not shouting, not at first. It was a murmur, a collective exhalation, as if the entire corridor had breathed out at once. Then silence. Then the shuffling of feet as people turned and walked away, each one returning to their hab cell or their corner or their crawlway to sit in the dark and contemplate what came next. The silence was worse than the shouting would have been. Shouting means anger, and anger means energy, and energy means there is still something left inside a person that is fighting. Silence means the fighting has stopped. Silence means acceptance, and acceptance in the underhive is the last thing that happens before the very worst things begin. It was during this period that I did something I had never done in 23 years as a ration runner. I went up, not far, not to the mid-hive or anywhere near it, but up 14 levels through the service stairwells to the edge of the Rendery district on level 47. I went because I needed to hear it. Or rather, I needed to not hear it. For my entire life, the Rendery had been a sound, not a specific sound, not something you could isolate and identify the way you could identify the hiss of a steam pipe or the clang of a bulkhead door. It was more fundamental than that. It was a vibration, a deep, constant tremor that traveled through the bones of the hive itself, transmitted through the structural columns and the floor plates and the wall panels until it became part of the ambient texture of existence, so pervasive and so constant that you did not notice it any more than you noticed the pressure of the air on your skin. The Rendery grinding, the Rendery processing, the Rendery doing what it had done for centuries without pause, converting the dead into the living, the bodies into blocks, the past into the future. That sound was the heartbeat of Hive Morrigal. It was the proof that the cycle continued. I climbed 14 levels on legs that were weak from reduced rations and muscles that burned with the effort of ascending stairs that had not been maintained in decades. I passed through corridors that were emptier than any I had seen, levels where the population had already begun to thin, where hab blocks stood open and vacant, their occupants fled or dead or simply gone, absorbed into the general entropy of a collapsing system. And as I climbed, I listened. I listened for the vibration. I listened for the deep, bone-level hum that had accompanied every moment of my life since birth. And what I heard as I ascended past level 50 and then level 49 and then level 48 and finally stood in a maintenance corridor on the outer perimeter of Rendery Primus itself was nothing. Silence. The machines were still. The great hydraulic presses that had compressed 1,000 tons of processed flesh per day were motionless. The enzymatic vats, vast tanks that should have been churning with chemical solution, were quiet. The conveyor systems that carried the bodies from the collection points to the processing lines, to the pressing stations to the packaging bays were frozen in place, their belts and rollers and hooks empty and still. I pressed my hand against the wall and felt nothing. No vibration, no tremor, no heartbeat. The Rendery was dead. The thing that had kept the hive alive for centuries had stopped, and the silence it left behind was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard, because it was not a sound at all, but an absence, a void where something essential had been, and the void was spreading through the structure of the hive, the way the greymouth spread through the bodies it consumed, filling every space with nothing. I went back down. I did not tell Ferusa what I had heard, or rather what I had not heard, because I think she already knew. I think she had always known. The routine she maintained, the manifests she checked, the stations she kept operational, were not preparations for a recovery that she believed was coming. They were rituals. They were the gestures of a woman who understood that the thing she served was dead, but could not bring herself to stop serving it, because the service was all she had, and without it she was just another hungry body in a corridor of hungry bodies, waiting for whatever came next. The black market was not new. The dregs had always had a shadow economy, a network of barter and trade operating beneath the official distribution system. The hub of it in our section was a place called the Wet Corridor, a stretch of abandoned maintenance tunnel where a permanent leak from a coolant main kept the air damp and the walls glistening. It had been a trading post for as long as anyone could remember, loosely controlled by a shifting coalition of fixers and gang affiliates. When the food ran out, the Wet Corridor transformed into the most important location in the dregs. People who had stockpiled ration blocks sold them at prices that would have been inconceivable weeks earlier. Within 2 weeks, monetary exchange became meaningless, and the market reverted to pure barter. A ration block for a working las pistol, a half block for a water filter, a quarter block for a knife. The currency of the dregs was no longer thrones or credits. It was calories. I went to the Wet Corridor on Cycle 74 because Ferusa sent me. She had contacts there, people she had dealt with for years in her capacity as a distribution overseer, and she wanted to know what was available and at what price. I went armed with a pipe wrench tucked into my belt and the last 3 ration blocks from Gruel Post Hethkin's emergency reserve wrapped in cloth and hidden inside my jacket. The Wet Corridor was crowded in a way I had never seen it, bodies packed shoulder to shoulder in the narrow tunnel, the air thick with the smell of unwashed humanity, and the sharp copper-edged tang that I would later learn to recognize as the smell of fear metabolized through skin and sweat. The trading was frantic and hushed, conducted in whispers and quick hand gestures, as if everyone was afraid that speaking too loudly might attract something they did not want to deal with. I saw things being sold that I had never seen on the market before: shoes, clothing, tools, personal items that people had carried for years, keepsakes and totems and small objects of sentimental value that meant nothing to anyone except the person selling them and the person buying them for a mouthful of gray paste. But it was at the back of the Wet Corridor, in the deepest section where the ceiling was so low you had to stoop, and the leak from the coolant main had created a permanent puddle that reflected the flickering of a single dying lumen strip, that I saw something that changed my understanding of what was happening. There was a stall there, if you could call it that, a plank of salvaged metal laid across 2 pipe brackets, and on it were arranged several objects wrapped in dark cloth. The seller was a man I did not recognize, thin and sharp-featured, with eyes that moved constantly and hands that never stopped adjusting the wrappings on his merchandise. He was selling meat, actual meat, not starch, not fungal paste, not the greasy residue of boiled vermin. Meat, dark red, cut into portions laid out with a butcher's precision on the cloth. The smell of it was overwhelming in that cramped space, rich and raw and alive in a way that nothing in the hive ever smelled. People were gathered around the stall, staring at the meat with an intensity that was almost religious. And when I pushed close enough to see, the man looked at me and smiled, and the smile was the worst thing about it, because it was the smile of a man who knew exactly what he was selling and was utterly at peace with the knowledge. I did not buy the meat, not for myself. I want to be clear about that, though I am no longer sure the distinction matters as much as I once believed it did. There was a woman in our group at Gruel Post Hethkin, an old pipefitter named Dreva Mosk, who had been too weak to leave her hab cell for over a week. She had given her rations to her grandchild, a boy of 6 or 7 named Cullen, who followed her everywhere with the quiet gravity of a child who has learned that the world is not a safe place. Dreva was dying. Not of anything specific, not of the greymouth or violence or disease. She was dying because she had chosen to stop eating so that Cullen could eat, and her body was shutting down one system at a time, quietly and methodically, the way the Hive's own machinery shut down when the power was cut. I had watched her deteriorate over the preceding days, her skin thinning to translucence over the bones of her face, her eyes sinking deeper into their sockets, her voice fading to a whisper that Cullen had to lean close to hear. And I had done nothing because there was nothing to do. There was no food, but here was food. Dark red, carefully cut, laid out on a metal plank by a man with quick eyes and steady hands who did not need to explain what it was. I stood there for a long time. I felt the weight of the 3 ration blocks inside my jacket, the last of Gruel Post Hethkin's emergency reserve that Ferusa had entrusted to me. I looked at the meat. I looked at the cellar. I thought about Dreva Mosk lying in her hab cell with her bones pushing through her skin and her grandson sitting beside her, watching her die with that terrible, patient gravity. And then I made a trade. 1 ration block for 2 portions of the meat. The seller wrapped them in a strip of cloth and handed them to me, and I took them, and I did not look at them. And I walked back through the wet corridor with the wrapped portions tucked against my chest, and the remaining 2 ration blocks in my jacket, and a feeling inside me that I could not name, something that was not quite shame and not quite relief, but existed in the space between the two, a gray area as featureless and indistinct as corpse-starch itself. I gave the meat to Dreva. I told her it was rat. She looked at me, and in her eyes, those sunken, dying eyes that had seen 60 years of underhive life and understood every lie it had ever produced, I saw that she knew. She knew what it was. She looked at the meat, and she looked at me, and she looked at Cullen, sitting on the floor with his knees drawn up, watching us with that steady, ancient gaze. And then she ate it. She ate it slowly, the way Ferusa had eaten the ration block that night in the back room, and she fed the rest to Cullen, and the boy ate it too, and neither of them said a word. Dreva lived another 11 days. Cullen survived longer. Whether either of them saw the end, I never learned. But I know what I did, and I know that when the time came, weeks later, to eat the cake from the threefold star's hand, the decision was not as difficult as it might have been for someone who had never crossed that particular line. I had already fed someone the flesh of their neighbor. I had already made the calculation that survival justified anything. The cake was just the next step along a path I had already started walking. The 2 remaining ration blocks I brought back to Ferusa. They were the last real food our group would see. This was the beginning of what the survivors would later call the harvest. Not openly, not in any official record that I am aware of, but in the whispered conversations of people who had been there and seen it and carried the memory of it like a splinter lodged beneath the skin. The harvest was not a single event. It was a process, a gradual erosion of the boundary between the thinkable and the unthinkable that accelerated as the hunger deepened. It started with the dead. The corpse collection had been suspended, which meant the bodies were accumulating. In the corridors, in the hab cells, in the crawlways and utility rooms, and every other space where people lived and died in the dregs. The guild of the Pallid Hand was no longer coming to collect them, and the gray-mouth contamination meant that official processing was impossible even if they had. So the bodies lay where they fell, and for a time people stepped around them or dragged them to side corridors, or covered them with whatever was available, and the smell grew worse with each passing cycle. And then, gradually, without any single moment of decision that I could point to, the bodies began to disappear. Not all of them, not randomly. The freshest ones first, the ones that had died most recently before decay or the gray-mouth contamination had a chance to set in. A body that was there in the evening would be gone by morning. Nothing left but a dark stain on the floor, and sometimes not even that. People did not talk about it. What struck me most forcefully during those early days of the harvest was the silence around it. There was no discussion, no debate, no moment of collective reckoning. It simply happened the way weather happens on worlds that have weather, a force that moved through the population without requiring permission or consensus. People ate, and they did not talk about what they ate, and if they saw their neighbor carrying something wrapped in cloth that was too heavy to be a ration block, they looked the other way. The social contract of the dregs, such as it was, had always been built on the principle of minding your own business. Now that principle was applied to its ultimate conclusion. But the individual acts of desperate survival quickly organized themselves into something more structured, because that is what happens in a hive. The hive is a system, and systems generate hierarchies, and hierarchies generate power. And power attracts the kind of people who know how to use it. Within 30 cycles of the last real distribution, the dregs had developed what amounted to a parallel economy based entirely on human flesh. There were organized groups, gangs mostly, but also ad hoc collectives of neighbors and former work crews who had taken to hunting. Not scavenging the dead, which was by now considered the baseline, the minimum. The thing that everyone did and no one discussed. Hunting. Active predation. Groups of armed men and women who moved through the corridors of the dregs looking for the vulnerable, the isolated, the weak. They operated with varying degrees of sophistication, from crude ambushes in dark corridors to almost professional operations that targeted specific hab blocks, sealed the exits, and went door to door. The meat from these hunts was consumed by the hunters themselves, and the surplus was sold on the black market, which had now expanded from the wet corridor to encompass an entire network of trading points throughout the dregs. The most organized of these groups called themselves the Gilt Knives, a name that might have been ironic if irony were a concept that had any meaning in Substratum 61. They were led by a woman named Vescara Thul, who had been a shift boss in one of the water reclamation plants before the famine, and who possessed the rare combination of physical presence and organizational intelligence that allowed her to command loyalty in a place where loyalty was a luxury few could afford. Vescara established rules for the Gilt Knives. Territories were divided. Hunting was scheduled to avoid overlap and conflict. A portion of every kill was tithed to a communal reserve that was distributed among the group's non-combatant members, the old and the young and the injured who could not hunt, but who served other functions. She even established a rudimentary code of conduct that prohibited the hunting of children under a certain age, though I heard conflicting accounts of how consistently this rule was enforced. The Gilt Knives were not the only such group. They were merely the largest and the most organized, and within a few weeks they controlled a significant portion of the dregs through a combination of force and the simple, irresistible logic of being the people who had the food. Let me tell you about the Ecclesiarchy, because what happened with the faith is important, and because it reveals something about the nature of the Imperium that the official histories will never contain. Hive Morgul, like every Hive City in the Imperium, had its ecclesiarchal presence. Shrines and chapels and minor basilicae dotted every level, from the soaring cathedral vaults of the upper spire, where the nobility worshipped in perfumed air and gilded light, to the crude, cramped prayer cells of the underhive, where the faithful knelt on bare metal and prayed to icons painted on rust-stained walls. The dregs had 3 official shrines, served by a rotating staff of lay preachers and minor clerics under the authority of a man named Confessor Harmond Bruel. Confessor Bruel was a type that the lower hive produced in abundance, a man of genuine conviction married to an absolute inability to see beyond the boundaries of his own doctrine. He believed, with a fervor that was either admirable or terrifying depending on your perspective, that the Emperor's will was manifest in every aspect of hive life, that suffering was a crucible through which faith was refined, and that the proper response to any hardship was increased devotion. When the famine began, Confessor Bruel did what his training and his belief demanded. He preached. He stood in his shrine on level 61, a room barely large enough to hold 50 people, and he told the starving congregation that the hunger was a test, that the Emperor had seen the weakness of their faith and had sent this tribulation to separate the devoted from the unworthy, that those who endured with prayer and patience would be rewarded, and those who succumbed to despair or sin would receive the punishment they deserved. He quoted scripture. He invoked saints. He wept, genuine tears rolling down a face gaunt with the same hunger that afflicted everyone else. And he promised on his immortal soul that deliverance was coming, that the Emperor would provide, that the faithful needed only to hold on, to endure, to believe, and the ships would come and the food would flow and the cycle would be restored. For a time, people believed him, or perhaps they wanted to believe him, which in the underhive amounts to the same thing. The shrines were packed. People who had not prayed in years, who had treated the Ecclesiarchy with the casual indifference that was the default religious posture of the lower hive, now crowded into the prayer cells and knelt on the metal floors and recited the litanies of faith with a desperate intensity that transformed the familiar words into something raw and urgent. Confessor Bruel took this as validation. He preached longer, louder, with more passion. He organized prayer vigils that lasted entire cycles, candle-lit gatherings in the shrine, where the congregation sang hymns and recited prayers and worked themselves into a state of collective ecstasy that, for the duration of the vigil at least, seemed to dull the hunger and replace it with something else, something fervent and hot that burned in the chest and made the eyes shine. Then someone discovered the stores. I do not know who found them or how. The lower hive had its own intelligence network, its own methods of acquiring information, and secrets that were kept behind locked doors in the upper levels had a way of seeping downward like everything else. The fact that reached the dregs passed from mouth to mouth with the speed and fury of a flame moving through dry tinder was this. The ecclesiarchal stores on level 42, the warehouses maintained by the church for charitable distribution and emergency relief, were full. Not just stocked, full. Ration blocks, water purification tablets, medical supplies, emergency nutrient paste. All of it sealed in climate-controlled vaults behind reinforced doors, guarded by armed church wardens and accessible only to senior ecclesiarchal personnel. While the dregs starved, while old men died with clean wax paper wrappers clenched in their fists, and mothers fed crushed insects to their infants, and organized gangs hunted their neighbors for meat. The church had been sitting on enough food to supply the lower hive for weeks. The reaction was not immediate. There was a period, perhaps 2 or 3 cycles, where the information circulated and people processed it, and the full weight of the betrayal settled into the collective consciousness of the dregs, like sediment settling to the bottom of a still pool. And then the reaction came, and it came with a violence that surprised even those of us who had watched the hunger strip away every other restraint. The shrines were the first to burn. Not literally, because fire in the lower hive is suicide, the air recyclers cannot handle it, and the ventilation systems will spread the smoke through a dozen levels before anyone can contain it. But they were destroyed, torn apart, The icons smashed, the prayer books shredded, the crude altar pieces reduced to fragments that were scattered through the corridors like confetti at a celebration of something terrible. Confessor Brohl's shrine on 61 was overrun by a crowd that I estimated at 300 people, though it might have been more. They came with tools and fists, and a fury that was not just anger, but something older and more primal, the rage of people who had placed their trust in something and discovered that the thing they trusted had been feeding while they starved. The Aquila symbols that decorated the shrine's entrance were torn down and smeared with filth. Someone had brought a tin of industrial marking paint and used it to scrawl words on the walls that I will not repeat, words that combined blasphemy and accusation in combinations that would have earned summary execution in normal times. Confessor Brohl himself was found 2 cycles later, hiding in a maintenance junction 4 levels below his shrine. What was done to him was thorough and methodical, and I will say nothing more about it except that when the people who found him were finished, there was not enough left for even the gilt knives to find useful. Around this time, leaflets began appearing in the corridors of the dregs, printed on actual paper, which none of us had seen in years. They drifted down through the ventilation shafts from the upper levels, crisp white sheets bearing the seal of the planetary governor, and a message in neat Gothic script urging the population to remain calm, to trust in the Imperium's providence, and to report any instances of civil disorder to their local enforcer precinct. The paper was thick and clean and smelled of nothing, and I held one in my hands and stared at it and understood, with a clarity that was physical in its intensity, that somewhere above us, kilometers above us, in the spire where the air was filtered and the light was real and the food was grown in hydroponic chambers tended by indentured servants, people were living as they had always lived. They were eating real food, not starch, not paste, not the processed dead. They were sleeping in rooms with temperature controls and clean water and windows that looked out over the hive's upper ramparts. They knew what was happening below them, the way you might know about a storm on a distant continent, as an abstraction, a data point, something that was happening to other people in a place you would never visit. The leaflet told us to remain calm. We used it as kindling to boil water. The destruction of the shrines was the moment when the last structural support of social order in the dregs gave way. The distribution network was gone. The enforcers were gone, or might as well have been, because the enforcer precinct on our level, the Iron Gate as everyone called it, had sealed its doors on cycle 68 and had not opened them since. Rumors varied as to what was happening inside. Some said the enforcers had received orders to stand down. Others said they had received no orders at all and had simply decided, individually and collectively, that enforcing the law in a place where the law had ceased to provide the basic necessities it demanded in return was a proposition that no longer made sense. A few darker rumors claimed the enforcers were dead, killed by each other in a dispute over their own ration reserves, their bodies sealed behind the armored doors of the Iron Gate where no one could reach them. I saw an enforcer once during this period, a single figure in battered riot armor moving quickly through a side corridor near the wet corridor, head down, visor sealed, carrying a large duffel bag over one shoulder that clinked with the sound of what might have been food canisters. The figure did not stop, did not look at anyone, did not respond when someone shouted at it. It moved through the crowd like a ghost, or like a deserter, which is perhaps the same thing in the end. With the faith broken and the law absent, the dregs became a hunting ground. Levels barricaded themselves against each other using salvaged metal, furniture, machinery components. Each barricaded section became an island with its own rules, and the spaces between became no man's land where predators moved and the unwary were taken. The gilt knives controlled the largest territory, spanning most of Substratum 61. Other groups held other sections. Alliances formed and dissolved. Skirmishes were fought in corridors and stairwells, brief and vicious, where the prize was the flesh of the defeated. I stayed with Ferusa. She had fortified Gruel Post Hethkin into a small stronghold defended by the Ration runners and a handful of others. Ferusa did not join the Gilt Knives, though Veskara Thul made the offer. She did not hunt. It was not Ferusa that Veskara came for the second time. It was me. She found me at the condensation tap, alone, filling containers. She was smaller than I had expected, lean and hard-faced, with close-cropped hair and hands scarred across the knuckles from years of industrial labor. She did not look like a monster. That was what I was not prepared for. She spoke to me the way a shift boss speaks to a useful worker wasting himself on a dead assignment. She told me Ferusa was going to get us all killed with her devotion to a system that no longer existed. She told me the Gilt Knives had food, structure, protection. She told me that what they did was no different from what the Rendery had always done, just more honest. The Rendery dressed it up in process and stamped the Aquila on the packaging, she said, but the fundamental transaction was the same. The dead feed the living. We just skipped the machinery. I told her I could not do what she did. She looked at me with an expression that was not contempt, but something worse, a weary recognition, and she said, "You already have." Then she walked away, and I stood there with the water containers in my hands, knowing she was right. The meat I had bought for Dreva Mosque, the portions wrapped in cloth. I had already crossed the line. The only difference between me and the Gilt Knives was that I had paid someone else to do the cutting. Ferusa maintained, with an iron discipline that I found both admirable and faintly unhinged, that the distribution infrastructure still existed, that it still mattered, that when the crisis ended, the feeding stations would need to be operational, and she intended hers to be ready. She was wrong, but her wrongness kept us alive, because it gave us structure when everything around us was dissolving into raw appetite. It was in the deepest pit of this madness, when the dregs had been without official food distribution for over 40 cycles, and the population had been reduced by what I estimate was at least a third through starvation, violence, and the slow grinding mathematics of a closed system consuming itself, that the whispers began. Not the ordinary rumors that had been circulating since the start. The speculation about causes and timelines and rescue convoys. These were different. These whispers had a texture to them, a deliberateness, as if they were not arising spontaneously from the collective anxiety of the population, but were being planted, seeded, cultivated with care and intention by hands that knew exactly what soil they were planting in. The first whisper came from below, literally below. The levels beneath Substratum 61 were officially derelict, condemned structures that had been abandoned generations ago when subsidence and sump gas infiltration had made them uninhabitable. Nobody went down there. The stairwells were sealed, the access tunnels were blocked with rubble and warning markers, and the general understanding was that anything living in those depths was something you did not want to meet. But the seals had been broken. I noticed it first on cycle 113, coming back from a water collection run to one of the few remaining functional condensation taps on our level. The access hatch at the far end of corridor 917, a heavy plasteel door that had been welded shut for as long as I could remember, was open. Not forced, not cut. Open, as if the welds had been carefully removed by someone with the right tools and the time to use them. And rising from the darkness beyond it was a smell I did not recognize, something warm and organic that was not the metallic staleness of hive air, or the chemical bite of industrial residue, or the awful sweetness of decomposition. It was something else, something that reminded me, in a way I could not articulate, of the descriptions I had heard of growing things, of places where matter was alive and multiplying rather than dead and recycled. I did not go through the hatch. I went back to Gruel post Hethken and told Ferusa what I had seen, and the look she gave me was the first time I saw fear on her face. Real fear, not the controlled tension that had been her default expression since the famine began, but something deeper and wilder that moved through her features like a shadow and was gone almost immediately, clamped down behind the iron discipline that had kept her functional while everyone around her unraveled. She told me to stay away from the lower levels. She told me to tell the others to stay away. She did not explain why, and I did not press her, because in the underhive there are things you learn not to ask about, and the look on Ferusa's face told me this was one of them. But staying away became increasingly difficult because the things from below were not staying below. Within a week of seeing the opened hatch, I began to encounter people in the corridors who did not belong. Not outsiders, not people from other levels or other sections, but people who were wrong in a way that was difficult to pin down with precision. They looked like underhivers. They wore the same kind of clothing, spoke with the same accent, moved with the same hunched, watchful posture that everyone in the dregs adopted. But there was something off about their proportions. Foreheads that were slightly too broad, eyes set slightly too wide apart, or at angles that were subtly different from the human norm. Hands with fingers that seemed a fraction too long, or that moved with a fluidity that suggested extra joints or tendons that were not standard issue. These people, and there were more of them with each passing cycle, appeared at the margins of the community. They showed up at barricade checkpoints with offers of trade. They lingered near the hab blocks where the youngest and the oldest had been gathered for protection, and they were always smiling. Not the predatory smile of the meat sellers in the wet corridor, or the desperate rictus of the starving. A calm, warm, almost parental smile that said, without words, "We understand. We have been through this too, and we are here to help." They brought food, and that single fact shattered every barrier that caution and instinct might otherwise have erected. They brought food, not corpse-starch, not human meat, not boiled insects or fungal scrapings. Actual food, pale, soft, slightly luminescent cakes that tasted of nothing I had ever experienced, faintly sweet and with a texture that was between bread and something gelatinous, something organic in a way that no product of the Rendery had ever been. They distributed these cakes freely without asking for payment or barter, handing them out to anyone who would take them, and in a population that had been starving for months, there were very few who would not. The cakes filled the stomach in a way that corpse-starch never had. You could feel them working, feel the energy spreading through your limbs, feel the hunger receding not just temporarily but completely, as if the emptiness that had been your constant companion for weeks had been filled in by something that understood the shape of it and fit perfectly. I ate one. Emperor, forgive me, I ate one. Ferusa told me not to. She looked at the cakes with the same fear she had shown when I told her about the opened hatch, and she said in a voice that was as close to pleading as I ever heard from her, that I should not eat them, that something was wrong, that food does not appear from nowhere in a starving hive without a cost. And she was right. She was absolutely right. But I was hungry. I had been hungry for so long that the hunger had become a physical structure inside me, a hollow framework of need that defined my every thought and movement and decision. And when someone offers you the one thing that your entire being is screaming for, the rational mind does not stand a chance. I took the cake from the hand of a smiling woman with eyes that were just a shade too far apart, and skin that had a faint, almost imperceptible sheen that was not sweat, and I ate it, and the relief was so profound that I nearly wept. The people who brought the food called themselves the family of the threefold star. They spoke of unity and salvation and a coming transformation that would end the suffering not just of the dregs, but of all humanity. Their language was couched in terms that echoed the Imperial faith, but subtly reframed it, replacing the distant punishing god-emperor with something they called the patriarch, a living presence that loved its children and wanted nothing more than to gather them close and make them whole. They held gatherings in the open spaces of the dregs, meetings that combined elements of a worship service with the warmth and intimacy of a family reunion, where newcomers were welcomed with embraces and given food and told that they were valued, that they mattered, that the starvation and the violence and the abandonment they had endured were over. The contrast between these gatherings and the broken shrines of the Ecclesiarchy, between the warm welcome of the threefold star and the empty promises of Confessor Bruel, between the food in your hand and the hunger in your gut, was so stark and so overwhelming that resisting it required a kind of strength that most people in the dregs simply did not have left. I attended 2 gatherings. At the first, I sat at the back and watched and listened and ate the food they gave me and felt the warmth of being surrounded by people who were not afraid, who were not hungry, who smiled and touched each other's hands and spoke in soft voices about a future that contained something other than darkness. At the second, someone touched me. A man with broad shoulders and that slightly too wide forehead, who sat beside me and placed his hand on the back of my neck, and the touch was warm, warmer than it should have been, and I felt something move through the point of contact, a sensation that was not quite pain and not quite pleasure, but something in between, something that went deeper than the skin, deeper than the muscle, all the way down to some fundamental level of my body that I had not previously known existed. I pulled away. The man smiled at me. That same calm, warm, parental smile. He said it was all right. He said the first touch was always strange. He said I would understand soon. I did not go to a third gathering. Something in me, some residual instinct that the hunger and the desperation had not entirely consumed, recoiled from what had happened. The touch on my neck had left no mark, no bruise, no visible sign, but I could feel something. A warmth, faint but persistent, that sat at the base of my skull like a second heartbeat, and when I lay in my hab cell at night trying to sleep, I could hear, or thought I could hear, a sound that was not the hum of the air recyclers or the distant rumble of the hive's machinery, but something else, something rhythmic and vast and patient that pulsed at the edge of perception like a signal from very far away. But the family of the threefold star were not the only ones who had come to the dregs with promises, because while they were working the western sectors, offering food and fellowship and the seductive warmth of belonging, something else was moving through the eastern sectors, something that operated on entirely different principles and pursued entirely different ends. The first sign was the smell, not the warm, organic scent that accompanied the threefold star, but something thicker, sweeter, heavier, like fruit left to rot in standing water. It seeped through the ventilation ducts and crept along the corridors, faint at first, barely noticeable over the general miasma of a starving underhive, but growing stronger with each passing cycle until it became a permanent presence in certain sections of the dregs, a cloying sweetness that coated the inside of the throat and lingered on the tongue. People who lived in the affected areas reported other changes. The ever-present damp of the lower hive, which was normally cold, became warm. The fungal growth, which had been stripped bare by hungry scavengers weeks ago, began to return, but different. The new growth thick and bulbous and a deep, bruised green that seemed to pulse faintly when you were not looking directly at it. And the people in those sections began to change. Not dramatically, Not all at once, but slowly, incrementally, in ways that were easy to dismiss if you were not paying close attention. A persistent cough that did not get worse, but also did not get better. A rash that spread and then stabilized, becoming a permanent feature of the skin, a rough gray-green texture that was not painful, but was clearly not normal. A swelling of the joints that should have been crippling but instead seemed to grant a strange, loose-limbed flexibility. And, most importantly, a cessation of hunger. People in the affected sections stopped being hungry. Not because they had found food, but because the hunger simply went away, replaced by a dull contentment, a profound and unshakable sense that everything was fine, that the body had what it needed, that there was nothing to worry about. They called themselves the Garden of Perpetual Rest, and their message was even simpler than the threefold stars. The threefold star promised transformation, evolution, a future. The garden promised relief, an end to pain, an end to hunger, an end to the endless, grinding suffering that was the only constant of life in the underhive. You did not need to believe in a patriarch or attend gatherings or allow strange hands to touch the back of your neck. You just needed to stop fighting, stop struggling, stop clinging to the miserable simulacrum of health and vitality that the hive demanded of its citizens. Let go. Accept the gift. The gift came in many forms. A drink of brackish water from a particular well on level 62 that tasted of copper and something sweet. A breath of the warm, spore-laden air in the eastern corridors. A touch, a handshake, a shared meal with someone whose skin had taken on that gray-green texture and whose smile was dreamy and distant and utterly, unsettlingly peaceful. The disease, whatever it was, spread through contact and through the environment, carried on spores and fluids and the simple, inevitable proximity of human beings living on top of each other in spaces too cramped for isolation. I saw the garden's converts in the corridors, and the thing you need to understand is that they were not suffering. That was what made them dangerous. The starving were suffering. The hunted were suffering. The people barricaded in their hab blocks, rationing their last scraps, listening to the sounds in the corridors outside, and wondering if the next knock on the door would be a friend or a predator. They were suffering. But the garden's people were not. They moved slowly, yes. Their skin was wrong. Their breath rattled in ways that suggested their lungs were filling with something that was not air. Some of them had growths, bulbous protrusions on the neck and shoulders, and hands that wept a clear, faintly luminescent fluid. But they were calm. They were content. They did not fight, did not hunt, did not hoard or steal or scheme. They simply existed, their bodies slowly transforming into something that was no longer entirely human. Their minds wrapped in a warmth that insulated them from the horror all around them. And in a place where horror was all there was, that insulation was attractive in a way that I cannot adequately convey to anyone who has not experienced prolonged, hopeless starvation. I saw Orvek Plan on cycle 127. He was standing in a corridor near the eastern perimeter, his old route, the route he had run for 11 years beside me. I almost did not recognize him. His skin had taken on the gray-green cast of the garden's converts, and his broad shoulders, the shoulders that had carried canisters with such effortless strength, were now rounded and swollen with growths that pushed against the fabric of his shirt. His hands were different, the fingers thickened, the joints inflamed and weeping that clear fluid. But his face was what undid me, because his face was still Orvek, still that expression of mild bemusement, still that half-smile that suggested the universe was a joke he was waiting to understand. Except now the smile was real, deeper and more settled than anything I had ever seen on him in 11 years of shared meals and idle conversation. He saw me, and he walked toward me, and I took a step back, instinctively, because the smell that came off him was thick and sweet and wrong, and because something in the way he moved was not quite right, too loose, too fluid, as if the bones inside him had softened to accommodate whatever was growing around them. He said my name. His voice was different, thicker, as if his throat was partially obstructed, but the inflection was the same gentle cadence that I had listened to across 1,000 shared ration blocks. He asked me how I was. He asked me if I was eating. And then he said in a voice that was so calm and so content that it made me want to scream, that he was not hungry anymore, that the hunger was gone, that everything was fine now, that there was a warmth inside him, a fullness, a sense of being held and nourished that he had never experienced in his entire life, not even when the rations were flowing and the cycle was intact. He said it was like being loved. He said it was like being home. He reached out to touch my arm, and I flinched away, and the look that crossed his face was not anger or hurt, but pity. Genuine, bottomless pity. The pity of someone who has found relief and cannot understand why you refuse it. He told me I did not have to keep suffering. He told me it was easy. He told me all I had to do was let go. I walked away from him. I walked away from the man I had eaten beside for 11 years, the closest thing I had to a friend, and I left him standing in that corridor with his gray-green skin and his weeping hands and his terrible, peaceful smile. And the thing I carried away from that encounter, the thing that sat in my chest like a stone for days afterward, was not revulsion. It was envy, because Orvek was not lying. He was not suffering. He had found what every person in the dregs was looking for, what the gilt knives hunted for with blades, what the Ecclesiarchy had promised and failed to deliver, what the Imperium supply chain was supposed to provide. He had found enough, and all it had cost him was everything he used to be. The two groups, the family of the threefold star and the Garden of Perpetual Rest, were aware of each other, more than aware. They were, I came to realize, in direct competition, not for territory, not for resources in the conventional sense, but for people, for bodies, for the raw human material that both groups needed for their own purposes. Purposes that were different in method, but perhaps not so different in ultimate intent. The threefold star wanted converts who were whole, who were healthy enough to be useful, who could be integrated into whatever structure they were building in the derelict levels below. The Garden wanted bodies that would accept the gift, that would transform and become part of whatever was growing in the eastern sectors, spreading through the ventilation and the water supply and the warm, damp spaces where the new fungus bloomed. Each group wanted what the other was taking, and as the surviving population of the dregs dwindled, the competition between them intensified. There were clashes. Not open warfare, not at first, but incidents. A threefold star gathering was disrupted when several attendees began coughing uncontrollably, expelling a fine, greenish mist that sent the rest of the congregation into a panic. A group of garden converts wandered into threefold star territory and were found the next day with their throats cut, their bodies arranged in a pattern that might have been a message or might have been a warning. The gilt knives, who had until now been the dominant power in the dregs, found themselves caught between the two factions and utterly unprepared to deal with either. Veskara Thul attempted to negotiate with the threefold star and was rebuffed with a gentleness that was more frightening than hostility. She attempted to drive the Garden's influence from her territory and discovered that the spore-laden air did not respect barricades. Within weeks, the gilt knives were dissolving, their members defecting to one faction or the other, or simply disappearing into the shrinking neutral zones where neither cult had yet established dominance. I want to be precise about what I saw during this period, because precision is the only weapon I have against the temptation to make this story simpler than it was. I remember standing at a barricade checkpoint and watching a woman walk past with a child on her hip, heading toward a threefold star gathering point. The child was laughing. I had not heard a child laugh in the dregs in over 2 months. The woman's eyes were clear and calm, and she moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew where her next meal was coming from. Behind me, on the other side of the barricade, a man sat against the wall with his knees drawn up, too weak to stand, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer or might have been nothing at all. 2 realities separated by 10 meters of corridor and the choice of which hand you took when someone offered it to you. The truth is that both groups offered real things to real people in real pain. The threefold star offered food and community and purpose. The garden offered relief from suffering. These are not trivial things. They are, in fact, the things that every human being needs most desperately, and the Imperium had failed to provide any of them. The distribution system had failed. The enforcers had failed. The Ecclesiarchy had failed. The entire vast grinding machinery of imperial governance, which demanded obedience and labor, and the consumption of the dead in exchange for the most basic continuity of existence, had failed. And into that failure, the way water flows into any available space, came the things that the Imperium had always warned about: the dark powers, the alien influence, the corruption that waits in the shadows for the moment when the light goes out. The Imperium's warnings were correct. The threats were real. But the Imperium's answer to those threats had always been the same: endure, obey, and trust in the system. And the system was what had broken. So what was left? I stayed with Ferusa. That matters. Through the emergence of the cults, through the dissolution of every other structure in the dregs, I stayed with her in the fortified shell of Gruul post-Hethkin. She was one of the few people who refused both groups, who maintained her barricades and her routines and her increasingly fictional belief that the supply chain would be restored. She had a small group around her, maybe 30 people, ration runners and their families, and a few others who had nowhere else to go. We survived on water from the condensation taps and the dwindling scraps of whatever could be found in the neutral zones. We were hungry all the time. We were afraid all the time. But we were ourselves. We were still human in the narrow, specific sense that our bodies had not been altered and our minds had not been claimed by anything beyond our own desperation. But I had eaten the cake, and the warmth at the base of my skull had not gone away. And at night, lying in the dark, listening to the distant sounds of a hive that was eating itself alive, I could feel it growing. The war between the threefold star and the garden came on cycle 139, and it was unlike anything the dregs had seen. The cannibals had fought with crude weapons over meat and territory. This was something else. The threefold star soldiers moved through the corridors in disciplined formations, their movements coordinated with a precision that went beyond training, as if they were receiving instructions from a single source, responding to commands that were not spoken aloud, but transmitted through some channel that only they could perceive. They carried weapons that I had never seen in the underhive, curved blades and compact firearms that looked like they had been manufactured rather than improvised, and they fought with a ferocity that was controlled and purposeful in a way that human rage almost never is. The garden's defenders were different. They did not form ranks. They did not coordinate. They simply absorbed. The threefold star soldiers would cut them down, and the fallen would lie where they fell, their bodies already beginning to swell and distort as the processes inside them accelerated. And from the fallen bodies, new growths would emerge, tendrils and spore pods and glistening sacs that burst when disturbed and released clouds of whatever the garden was spreading. The corridors where the fighting took place became impassable within hours, choked with organic matter that grew over the walls and floor and ceiling, transforming the rigid geometry of the hive into something that looked like the interior of a living organism. I watched the battle for Substratum 60 from the top of a barricade near the freight shafts, and what I saw defied every assumption I had held about what conflict looked like in the Hive. The threefold Star's forces moved with an eerie synchronization, squads of 10 or 12 operating as single organisms, flowing around obstacles and through choke points with a coordination that no amount of training could explain. When one fell, the others did not pause. They adjusted, reformed, continued, as if the loss was already factored into a calculation that was being performed somewhere else, by something that could see the entire battle at once and move its pieces accordingly. The garden's defenders were chaos by comparison, shambling figures whose bodies had been reshaped by the corruption into forms that were grotesque but undeniably resilient. I saw a garden convert take a last bolt through the chest and continue walking, the wound closing behind a tide of gray-green tissue that swelled from the edges of the impact crater and sealed it shut within seconds. I saw another lose an arm to a curved blade and simply look at the stump with an expression of mild curiosity before the limb began to regenerate. The new growth darker and more textured than the original, glistening with fluid that hissed faintly where it dripped onto the metal floor. Neither side could truly kill the other. The threefold Star could not outfight an enemy that did not die in any conventional sense, and the garden could not outmaneuver an enemy that thought with a single mind across 1,000 bodies. The dregs were being ground to nothing between them. We heard the fighting from Gruul Post Hethkin. The sounds carried through the structure of the hive itself, transmitted through the metal walls and the floor plates, a bass vibration that you felt in your teeth more than you heard in your ears. Ferusa kept us locked down. She reinforced the barricades. She rationed the water. She maintained the routine. She was magnificent, and she was doomed, and I think she knew both things with equal clarity. The threefold Star had approached us twice more since their initial overtures, each time with more urgency and less patience. The last messenger, a young woman with that characteristic broadness of feature and an intensity of gaze that made it difficult to look away, had told us that the patriarch was calling all children home, and that those who refused the call would not be protected when the garden's corruption consumed the remaining habitable sections of the dregs. Ferusa had told the messenger in language that was direct and unambiguous, where the patriarch could place his call. The messenger had smiled that terrible warm smile and left, and Ferusa had sealed the barricade behind her and turned to face us, and for a single unguarded moment I saw on her face an expression that was not fear or anger or determination, but grief, pure and simple, the grief of a woman who understood that the world she had spent her life maintaining no longer existed. Ferusa died on cycle 144, not in the fighting, not from starvation, not from the garden's corruption. She died of the Greymouth, the contamination that had started the entire cascade, the biological agent that had entered the corpse processing chain and set fire to the food supply, finally reached our section of the dregs through the water system. How it got there is something nobody could explain. Perhaps it had always been there, dormant in the pipes, waiting for conditions to align. Perhaps it mutated. Perhaps it was guided. Others in our group fell ill within hours. I did not. I drank the same water, breathed the same air, and the Greymouth passed through me as if I were not there. Ferusa noticed. She looked at me with an expression I could not read, and I think in that moment she understood something about me that I was not yet ready to understand about myself, that whatever the cake had planted in me was keeping me alive in ways that had nothing to do with generosity. The first symptom was vomiting, which in a population that was already malnourished and dehydrated was catastrophic. Then the graying of the skin, spreading from the hands and feet inward, the flesh softening, becoming spongy, losing its structural integrity. Ferusa fought it for 3 days. She continued to give orders from her bunk, her voice growing hoarser as her throat was affected, her hands wrapped in cloth because the skin on her fingers had begun to separate from the muscle beneath. On the 3rd day, she asked me to sit with her, and I did. And she looked at me with eyes that were still sharp, still present, still Ferusa, despite everything her body was doing, and she said something that I have carried with me ever since. She said that the Hive did not care, that it had never cared, that the cycle she had devoted her life to maintaining, the collection and the processing and the distribution, the endless turning of dead into food and food into living and living into dead again, was not a covenant or a system or even a machine. It was an appetite, the Hive's appetite. And when the appetite was fed, the Hive tolerated the people inside it the way a body tolerates the bacteria in its gut, not out of kindness but out of utility. And when the appetite was not fed, the tolerance ended, and the Hive consumed its people the same way it consumed everything else, without thought, without mercy, without even the awareness that the things it was consuming had ever been anything more than raw material. She died that night. I wrapped her body in the cleanest cloth I could find and carried her to the corridor outside and laid her there because there was nowhere else. There was no guild to collect her. There was no Rendery to process her. The cycle she had believed in was broken, and Ferusa Dolm, who had spent her entire life as a cog in that cycle, was now just another piece of organic matter in a hive that had forgotten what to do with its dead. After Ferusa's death, the group at Gruul Post Hethkin dissolved. Some went to the Threefold Star. Some simply walked into the garden's territory and let the spores take them. A few tried to find passage to the upper levels, climbing through service shafts and abandoned lift corridors toward the mid-hive where rumor said there was still order, still food, still something resembling the life they had known. I do not know if any of them made it. I stayed, not because I had a plan or a purpose or even the energy to move, but because the warmth at the base of my skull was no longer just warmth. It was a voice, not words, not language, not anything so crude as spoken communication. It was a pull, a directionality, a sense of where I was supposed to go and what I was supposed to do that operated below the level of conscious thought. The cake I had eaten weeks ago, the pale, luminescent cake from the hand of the smiling woman, had not been food. It had been an introduction, a seed. Something had been planted in me, and it had been growing in the dark of my body the way the garden's fungus grew in the dark of the hive walls, and now it was making its presence known. I went down, through the opened hatch on corridor 917, down the stairs that should have been impassable, into the derelict levels that were supposed to be uninhabitable. They were not derelict, they were transformed. The walls were covered with a growth that was not fungal and not mechanical, but something in between, a ribbed, glistening tissue that pulsed faintly with its own light, a pale blue-white luminescence that made the old lumen strips unnecessary. The air was warm and humid and alive with a complex web of scents that my nose could not fully decode, but that my body responded to at a level deeper than smell, a chemical language that was speaking directly to something inside me that had not existed before I ate the cake. There were people there, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, people from the dregs and from other levels, people who had come down through other hatches and other stairs, drawn by the same pull that had drawn me. They moved through the transformed corridors with the easy, purposeful movements of people who knew exactly where they were going, and their faces wore that same calm, warm expression that I had seen on the Threefold Star's missionaries. But their bodies were different, changed. Not in the gross, obvious way of the garden's converts, not with rot and swelling and the dissolution of human form. This was subtler. The broadening of the skull, The widening of the eyes, the slight elongation of the limbs, the skin taking on a faint, almost imperceptible sheen. They were still human if you glanced quickly. But if you looked closely, if you paid attention to the small details, the way I had always paid attention to the small details, you could see that they were becoming something else. And at the center of it all, in a space that had been carved out of the hive's foundations, a vast chamber supported by pillars of the same ribbed, luminescent tissue, was the thing they called the patriarch. The air around it was warm, blood-warm, and it moved in slow currents that felt like breathing, as if the chamber itself was a lung. The floor beneath my feet pulsed with a rhythm that was not mechanical, a slow, deep throb that traveled up through my legs and settled into my chest and synchronized with my heartbeat until I could not tell where my pulse ended and its began. It was massive, larger than anything living had a right to be in a space built for humans. Its body a fusion of chitin and muscle and something older than both, coiled in the center of the chamber like a thought made solid. Its head turned toward me and I felt the weight of its attention, the way you feel the pressure of deep water, a force that compressed everything it touched into something denser and more essential. The warmth at the base of my skull flared into white heat, a searing recognition, and the sound I had been hearing at the edges of sleep for weeks resolved into something clear and total, not a voice but a presence, vast and patient and hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. I understood with the clarity that left no room for doubt that I had been chosen, that the seed inside me had taken root, that the person I had been was being incorporated into something larger, something that needed me, valued me, that would never let me starve or feel the grinding emptiness that had defined my entire existence. I should have fought it. I know that now. I knew it then, in the small, shrinking part of me that was still Tembrek Wohl, ration runner, citizen of the Imperium, faithful servant of a god-emperor who sat on a golden throne half a galaxy away, and who had never, in all the years of my life, given me anything except the taste of the dead in my mouth and the promise that my own body would feed someone else when I was gone. I should have fought it. But the hunger was gone. The fear was gone. The loneliness, the grinding, relentless loneliness of a life lived in a city of 12 billion people who were all strangers, who were all alone, who were all just meat waiting to be processed, that was gone too. And in its place was the warmth, the belonging, the pull. I did not fight. The Imperium's ships arrived on what I believe was cycle 181, though by that point my sense of time had become unreliable, compressed, and stretched by the changes in my perception that accompanied my ongoing transformation. They came in force. A convoy of supply ships escorted by a naval squadron, dispatched from a staging base 3 systems away as part of a routine replenishment run that had been delayed by the Orc incursion, and then delayed again by warp turbulence, and then delayed a 3rd time by the administrative procedures required to reclassify the mission priority after someone, somewhere, in an office on a world I will never see, finally processed the overdue status reports from Vothrek Quintus and realized that the planet had not received a supply shipment in over 200 standard Terran days. The ships entered orbit. They hailed the planetary governor. They received no response. They hailed the Hive Moragul command spire. They received no response. They deployed survey teams in armored landers that descended through the planet's polluted atmosphere and set down on the landing platforms of the upper spire, and the teams disembarked into silence. I know this because I was watching, not with my own eyes, with something else, something that had developed in the weeks since my descent into the lower levels. A secondary awareness that was connected to the network, to the web of perception that the patriarch maintained through its children. I could see through the eyes of my brothers and sisters who had infiltrated the upper levels, who had been there for much longer than the famine, who had been quietly, patiently seeding the population of Hive Moragul for generations before the food ran out and the whole thing collapsed. The famine was not their doing, or so I believed at first. But the deeper I sank into the network, the more I felt the patriarch's vast intelligence brushing against my own, the less certain I became. There were memories in the web that were not mine, fragments of perception from brothers and sisters who had been embedded in the hive for decades, who had worked in the Renderies, who had served in the Guild of the Pallid Hand, who had access to systems and supply chains and processing vats that no outsider would ever see. And in those fragments, like splinters of glass caught in murky water, I glimpsed something that I cannot confirm and cannot forget. A substance introduced into Rendery Primus, not from outside the hive, but from within it. A biological agent of uncertain origin cultured in the deep levels, where things grew that had no names and served purposes that only the patriarch understood. The Greymouth. Not a natural contamination, not an accident, a tool, a lever applied at precisely the right point in the supply chain to bring the entire structure down in a way that looked like catastrophe but functioned like strategy. I cannot prove this. The memories are fragments, impressions, half-formed images seen through eyes that were not entirely human. But the question sits in me like the warmth at the base of my skull, persistent and unanswerable. Did the patriarch break the cycle, or did the patriarch simply know it was going to break and position itself to catch what fell? I do not know. I am not sure the distinction matters. The result was the same, and they had used it. The survey teams found the hive. They found the corridors, the hab blocks, the feeding stations, the manufactoria, the great Rendery complexes silent and cold, their vats empty, their presses still. They found the bones. Billions of them, or what remained of billions, scattered through the lower levels in drifts and piles and individual arrangements that told stories the survey teams did not want to read. They found the barricades, the improvised fortifications of a population that had turned on itself when the food ran out. They found the shrines, defaced and destroyed, the Aquila smeared with substances the survey team's equipment identified, but whose implications the teams chose not to fully examine. They found the eastern sectors where the garden had taken root, entire levels consumed by organic growth that pulsed and breathed and turned the air into something that no unprotected human could inhale without consequences. They sealed those sectors. They marked them for purification. They wrote in their reports that a xenos-biological contamination of indeterminate origin had been detected, and that further investigation by specialized inquisitorial assets was recommended. What they did not find, what their surveys and their auspex scans and their careful, methodical sweeps did not reveal, was us, the family of the threefold star, the patriarch's children. We were there. We were everywhere. In the walls, in the deep levels, in the service tunnels and the ventilation shafts, and the spaces between the spaces that the survey team's instruments were not calibrated to detect. We watched them through eyes that were almost human. We breathed the same air they breathed. We waited with a patience that was not human at all, a patience that came from the patriarch, from the vast intelligence that held us all in its awareness the way a hand holds grains of sand. The Imperium had come to assess the damage and to resupply what remained and to file its reports and move on to the next crisis. It did not understand what had happened. It did not understand what was growing in the bones of the hive. It did not understand that the famine had not destroyed the population of Hive Moragul. It had transformed it. I am telling you this from a place that I cannot name and a time that I cannot specify with precision. The part of me that is still Tembrek Wol, the ration runner, the man who ate corpse-starch every day of his life and checked the canisters for rot breach and nodded to the same faces in the same corridors. That part is still here. It is smaller than it was. It is quieter. It shares the space behind my eyes with something else, something that thinks in patterns I do not have the vocabulary to describe, that sees the hive not as a collection of corridors and hab blocks and people, but as a single organism, a host, a body waiting to be claimed. I can still remember what it was like to be hungry. I can still remember the taste of the starch, the gray paste that was the foundation of everything. The meal of the dead fed to the living in an endless cycle that the Imperium called necessity, and that I now understand was something simpler and more brutal. It was the hive eating itself. It was always the hive eating itself. The only question was what would be left when the eating was done. The Imperium's reports will say that Hive Morgul suffered a catastrophic supply chain failure exacerbated by biological contamination, resulting in mass casualty and civil breakdown. The reports will note the detection of xenos biological agents and recommend follow-up investigation. The reports will be filed. The investigation will be deprioritized because there is always another crisis, another incursion, another world on fire. And in the time that the Imperium takes to process its paperwork and allocate its resources and turn the slow, grinding wheels of its bureaucracy, the patriarch will continue to build. The family will continue to grow. The children will continue to multiply in the dark spaces of a hive that the Imperium believes it has accounted for. I was Tembrek Wol. I was a ration runner in the dregs of Hive Morgul on Vothrek Quintus. I ate the dead every day of my life, and I never questioned it, because that was the cycle, and the cycle was all there was. Then the cycle broke, and in the breaking I learned something that the Imperium does not want anyone to learn, something that the Ecclesiarchy cannot preach, and the Administratum cannot file, and the enforcers cannot enforce. I learned that hunger is stronger than faith, stronger than law, stronger than loyalty, than duty, than the 10,000 years of doctrine that holds the Imperium together. Hunger does not care about your God Emperor. Hunger does not care about your Aquila, or your prayers, or your carefully maintained supply chains. Hunger is the oldest force in the universe, older than the Imperium, older than humanity, older than the stars themselves. And when hunger comes, when real hunger comes, the kind that hollows you out and leaves nothing but the need, you will do anything to make it stop. You will eat the dead. You will eat the living. You will eat the lies of alien prophets and the gifts of rotting grandfathers, and you will call it salvation because the alternative is feeling that emptiness for one more second. The hive is quiet now. The ships have gone. The supplies they left sit in the upper spire, distributed to the handful of survivors that the survey teams identified and processed and entered into their ledgers. The Renderies are being restarted. The corpse processing chain is being rebuilt. New bodies are being collected, the dead of the famine, and they are being fed into the machines, and the machines are pressing them into gray blocks, and the blocks are being sealed in canisters and sent down the rails to the feeding stations that are slowly, painfully, resuming their function. The cycle is starting again, and we are waiting, patient, fed, changed. Down here in the dark where the Imperium does not look, where the light does not reach, where the hive keeps its deepest secrets. We are what happens when the food runs out and no one comes. We are what grows in the space between one meal and the next. We are hungry. We have always been hungry. And this time, when we eat, we will not stop. That is what the voice says, the voice that has been speaking through me for this entire account, the voice you have been listening to without knowing it was not entirely mine. But there is a moment sometimes in the space between one heartbeat and the next when the warmth falters, when the signal from the patriarch dims, just for an instant, like a lumen strip flickering before it dies. And in that instant, I am Tembrek Wool again. Just Tembrek. Standing in a corridor that smells of rust and old coolant, holding a ration block that tastes of chalk and death, wondering if there will be more tomorrow. And I am afraid, not of the hunger, not of the dark, but of the thing that is not afraid, the thing that sits where I used to be and looks out through my eyes and calls itself we and means it. I do not know how much of me is left. I do not know how much longer the flickering will continue before the light goes out for good, and there is only the warmth and the signal and the patient, endless hunger of something that was never human and never will be. But right now, in this breath, in this single guttering moment between what I was and what I am becoming, I want you to know that I was here, that I was real, that I ate the dead and I walked the corridors and I carried the canisters, and I was a man once, before the hive ate me too,